we've had a lot of changes in statute. There have been a lot of changes in state bills. So we'll talk about that to just set a context and have a history moving forward. Then the system for school improvement. So you have this handbook, and we want to walk through pieces of that. We'll touch on the 4 domains. We'll take a look in that material that Becky Peters copied for you, just to familiarize ourselves with what's in there and what it is. Then we want to talk about the continuous improvement cycle. You'll notice that the tabs in that handbook go through each one of those steps, each one of the steps through the continuous improvement cycle. We'll look at them. I want to just highlight a couple of pieces in each of them and then show you the materials that are in there. The needs assessment, we're fortunate enough today to have Dr. Shepard with us, who conducted the needs assessment and root cause analysis, and we'll have him talk about his experience doing that. We'll show you some of the materials that are in there. Because of that experience, we learned some things and changed a number of things in that process, so we'll look at those things. The process that everybody, or the step that everybody is in right now, is the step where we're creating that plan. So we want to talk about that, touch a bit on what the requirements under the bill are for that plan, and then the expectations of the State Board of Education in regards to those plans moving forward. And then some of the technicalities of that we may discuss here. How are we going to submit that? I don't know if we really ever talked about it. Is it going to be an email? Is it going to be? So we'll kind of touch on some of those things. Then plan implementation, monitoring work, adjust course, and then at the end, moving forward, there's some things that we have a bit of clarity on, funding, some of the timelines regarding that, just some of those conversations around that. Like I said, most of this has been a learning experience for me because there are people in this agency I didn't know exist, and now I've met with every single team member, I think, from every single section because they all have participated in moving the work forward. So, any questions? All right, everybody's so quiet. I don't want to just be talking the whole time. I'm sick of myself. All right, I'll be referring to my notes because I'm really forgetful. So if you see me looking at this and checking stuff off, I just want to make sure that when we plan this, that I touch on the things that I had intended to talk about or that we had discussed. But like I said, if you have a question, please stop. If you want to discuss something, slow us down. Let's talk about it, okay? All right, so in 2015, Utah was operating through a flexibility waiver under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. For Title I school improvement, and if you'll remember these, there were 2 categories of schools that were identified. Priority schools, who were the lowest 5% of Title I schools on the state accountability system, and then there were focus schools, and these were the lowest 6 to 10% of those Title I schools. Those schools were required during that flexibility waiver to select and work with one of USBE's approved school turnaround team leaders. So we had vetted a list of folks who had done this work before, and those Title I schools would select one of those to come in and construct school support teams. The school support teams worked with those schools through a system that had been developed. So this was a process for Title I schools, the Utah Title I system of support. Through that process, needs assessments were conducted, root cause analysis, they developed school improvement plans, they implemented those plans, and there was a system, much like we have here for those Title I schools, all the processes, procedures, templates, forms, formats to conduct that work. In 2015, Utah passed Senate Bill 235. I know a lot of you in this room are familiar with that bill, the School Turnaround and Leadership Development Act. SB 235 identified the lowest performing 3% of all schools in Utah, so that was based on 1 year of accountability. Funding was allocated to the Utah State Board of Education to approve a list of providers. Then those schools that were identified under Cohort 1 under 235 selected one of those providers from the USBE approved list. USBE contracted with that provider to go out and work with those schools. They were there to conduct needs assessments, root cause analysis, develop plans, implement plans, monitor that work and evaluate it, adjust course for those 3 years. What happened was some of the schools that had already been identified under Title I for school improvement had started a process. They had started working with their school support team to conduct that work, Richard, and so they were identified again as a state school turnaround. So those schools were kind of stuck balancing both initiatives. It was confusing. It was a bumpy ride through that process. So moving forward, 2015 was a busy year, apparently. Congress reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act as the Every Student Succeeds Act. As part of that reauthorization, states were required to develop and have approved by the Department of Education consolidated plans. A part of the consolidated plans was how states were going to address the lowest performing 5% of Title I schools. Those schools, they gave it a new title. It's no longer priority and focus. It's comprehensive support and improvement. They call them CSI schools. There's another element to that that we won't get into, but just so you know the work that went into that consolidated plan, that was approved that was amended in 2015. Utah's consolidated plan was approved just at the end of July of 2018. And there's a reason for that. There was a lot of negotiation because in 2017, the legislature amended 235 into 234, the School Turnaround and Leadership Development Act, and there were some key changes in that bill. Some of the key changes in the amendment were that the lowest performing 3% of schools are now based on 2 consecutive years of accountability. USBE, so there's another piece of this. USBE contracts or hires an outside agency to go into the schools identified for school turnaround to conduct the needs assessment and root cause analysis, independent of the provider. So that was a piece that you've gone through this year, you've implemented that, and that was a piece of the law that we followed through with. The USBE approves a list of turnaround providers. What's different from the first law is now the money flows through USBE to the LEAs who conduct RFPs, select one of those providers, and then contract with the provider to come into the school based on the needs assessment and root cause analysis and develop a plan, implement a plan, and go through that process for those 2 years of implementation. So all of this legislation and all of these bills, the state board decided that the best manner moving forward was to avoid the confusion that had happened the first go-around between federal programs and the state initiative. And so what they decided to do was align the initiatives. So the processes, and so I'll tell you, here's the next slide. So what they did was they aligned a lot of this language. So as we were developing our ESSA consolidated plan, the decision was instead of, and the subsequent board rule, instead of having an accountability system for Title I, an accountability system for state schools, there would be one accountability system for identification purposes. Schools won't be double identified. So if a school is identified for state school turnaround, they won't be identified for federal school Title I improvement. There won't be double funding though either. So that's the process moving forward. Here's the big piece, and this is where there was a lot of, so all of those things create a process where there's a lot of board discussion, there's a lot of involvement from every section at the agency. It's required a lot of outside stakeholder input to get to this point with these 3 bullet points here moving forward. So once a school is identified for either state school turnaround or Title I school improvement, the process will be the same. There will be a needs assessment, there will be a root cause analysis, a plan development, plan implementation, evaluation of progress, adjusting course, and then we start all over again. It's that cycle. Everybody really, this is probably not new news. So one of the things that the agency was charged to do, much like when we were working with ESEA under the flexibility waiver was to create a system of support. This time, it's the same for federal programs as it is for state turnaround schools.
So, back one slide.
Please, yes.
Sorry. When you say that they go through the exact same process, is that, if I'm in the bottom 5% of Title I but not in turnaround, are we still obligated to have an outside person do the needs assessment and still obligated to hire a provider? That's
a great question. When I say the process, what I'm talking about specifically is that each school will go through this particular process of a needs assessment, root cause analysis.
But who does it is maybe different.
That's the question. So state turnaround schools are required to select one of the vetted approved list of turnaround providers. Title I schools will not be, at least at this point in the conversation. I think there's still agency leadership conversation.
They will have a needs assessment root cause done by an external group that's external to the LEA in the school. Oh. They will not be required to...
At whose expense?
We're working all of that out, Mitch. They will not be required to select a provider off of a vetted list.
By the way, it was the fluorescent orange garlic cheese that ended up catching the fish. I knew Mitch wanted it.
I was wondering.
I just know Mitch for number.
I've heard it's delicious.
Yeah. I've got some other try if you want to try. Okay, so to this piece of it here. So in this handbook, we're gonna, we'll walk through each of these steps. We've been in the process of developing this handbook, and we're still in the process of developing it. The version you have in front of you is a draft version. It is subject to changes. We learned a lot going through the needs assessment process and root cause analysis, and we changed a lot of things there. And moving forward, we'll probably change things again. The step we're in now, setting the direction and developing a plan, we have things in there that I'll go through, but like I said, we know that some of those things will probably change, and we want to just make sure that whatever we're doing moving forward, where the state board intends for us to align these initiatives and have these processes be the same, everybody will be going through this, we'll be making changes as we go forward. So here's the spiel that I wrote down, my little speech about it. In order to facilitate alignment, the board has been in the process of developing a Utah Systems of Support for School Improvement, a handbook used to implement the continuous school improvement cycle. Utah's continuous school improvement cycle is built around 4 domains for rapid school improvement. The 4 domains is the centerpiece of this document. So everything goes back to those 4 domains. It is the expectation of the Utah State Board of Education that the processes, procedures, protocols, templates, and formats contained in the handbook will be followed with fidelity for schools identified for school turnaround or identified for Title I school improvement. All right. So in your packet of goods, there is a document called the 4 Domains for Rapid School Improvement. This document breaks it down. I mean, this is, like I said, this is pretty much the original publication. This really sets the direction and gets to the heart of the information that's in there. The website for the Center on School Turnaround has a lot of other documents that have additional research and have expanded upon this document. This at least gives you the base, the information. The 4 domains are those areas of focus, and the areas are turnaround leadership, Domain 2, talent development, Domain 3, instructional transformation, Domain 4, culture shift. Be careful with that word. If you go through the document, you'll see that, for example, on page 5, in Domain 1, turnaround leadership, under each of those domains, there are additional practices that are listed. So for turnaround leadership, experience and research has demonstrated that the practices that we need to be looking at to see if they're done well, should make improvement in that school in that domain for turnaround leadership. Prioritize improvement and communicate its urgency, monitor short and long-term goals, customize and target support to meet needs. And then if you go through the document, you'll also see that there are particular indicators under there. So to see if that needs or improvement is being prioritized and communicated, that its urgency is there, it lists a number of indicators there. It lists them by school level, district level, even SEA level as a system. Domain 2, talent development, the practices under there would be recruit, develop, retain, sustain talent, target professional learning opportunities, set clear performance expectations. Domain 3, instructional transformation, diagnose and respond to student learning needs, provide rigorous evidence-based instruction, remove barriers and provide opportunities. Domain 4, culture shift, build a strong community intensely focused on student learning, solicit and act upon stakeholder input, engage students and families in pursuing educational goals. And if you go through the document, it'll list under there particular indicators. One thing that I'll just point out at this point, in some of the materials you'll notice that we have, as part of the needs assessment section, rubrics where we're weighting those indicators based on those practices in those domains. So that language is repeated throughout in the former domains. It really is the center of that document through the school improvement cycle. If you attended LIFT, Janice, have you ever attended LIFT?
Not ever. I know nothing.
You've become really familiar with the 4 domains because it's been the focus of UEPC and LIFT as schools have gone through that and leadership teams have gone through that particular training. Anybody have any questions about those 4 domains or any comments, any additional thing you'd like to add?
I just really like the last bullet on the culture shift. I wish they had put that in here, that it's not engaging students and families for the sake of engagement, it's for educational goals. I like that. Sometimes that little is missing.
You know, one of the things that one of our colleagues here that works in the agency is Cheryl Ellsworth. I think you probably all know Cheryl. She is our specialist with community engagement, and one of the things that she always tells me when we talk about it is, you know, we talk about proven things that make a difference in schools, and parent engagement and community engagement is one of those things that evidence shows actually does make a difference. So I'm glad you pointed that out. She was just talking to me about it yesterday. She made me stay clear till 4 o'clock just so I could hear about it. That's overtime. It's comp time. Oh. Okay. So if you look, another part of this structure in this diagram, so we have the 4 domains in the middle. It's for the camera. Around the side this is the continuous improvement cycle and the steps under the continuous improvement cycle. And we're going to walk through each one of those in the handbook here just to talk about, and the way that the continuous improvement cycle is organized through the handbook. It starts out with an introduction. It explains what we mean here. In a lot of cases, it gives you an example, and then following that are materials and tools, formats that you can use to go through that process in that particular step. So the continuous improvement cycle is made up of 6 steps. Setting the direction, assessing needs, which you've done, creating the plan where you are right now, implementing the plan, monitoring work against that plan, how much progress are we making, and then adjusting course where that needs to happen. So let's get into it. If you'll take a look at just under that first tab in the handbook, and by the way, as we go through this, I brought my trusty notebook that contains every note I've ever taken for the past year. So if you have questions, let me know. If we can't answer them immediately, I'll write them down so that I make sure that I have them. Under that first tab is a table of contents. Following that, there's an introduction. And the introduction essentially goes through what I just said. This is what is in this book. there are a couple of tools in there so that if you were starting the process immediately, you could go through and see just on page 2 there is the purpose, and then it goes through the process step by step. This is what would happen from at the very inception of it all the way through. It talks about if you're a turnaround school or you're a Title I school, who's responsible for those types of things. And then there are even some sample parent notification letters on page 6, translated in Spanish. Thank you for our colleague Jeff Ojeda. I took a stab at it and handed it to him, and he said, "You're way off. That's not what that says at all." So, so there, you've got those sample parent notification letters, whether you're a turnaround school or a Title I school. There are some tools for scheduling. So when our contract provider comes in to conduct the needs assessment and root cause analysis, we can actually start out by setting up a schedule there. And just, you can flip through those tools there in the front. So then we get to that first tab, set the direction. So this is where I try to make Becky roll her eyes again. Have you guys ever seen the show on HBO? It's called Hard Knocks. Well, what this show is this film crew comes in from HBO, and they go to various NFL football teams in training camp. And they follow them through training camp day by day, and they conduct interviews, and they just follow these players around. Well, this year, Hard Knocks is focused on the Cleveland Browns. If you know anything about NFL football, the Cleveland Browns last year went absolutely defeated. They didn't win a game last year. So I was fascinated by this whole process. So one of the things they did right at the inception with these players, this is episode number 1. This is the conversation with these players. The coach had these players write down on a piece of paper why they were there and what they hoped to get out of the experience. So it shows, each of these players writing down to help my family or to whatever, to get famous or to make money. They each wrote down a different thing. And then it was the next day they were supposed to put that or that night put it by their nightstand, and then the next morning they would wake up and they would read that thing. This is why I'm doing it, and this is where I'm going. And as I'm watching that, I thought, well, here's my goofy story for set the direction. This is exactly what this step is for. So any organization needs to know where it is and where it wants to be in order to improve. The direction for a school includes, at a minimum, a mission statement, student-focused goals, and goal performance measures. And so here's the brief definition. And you can see that if you look through that tab. This is in there. It talks about it. The mission is what the organization does and for whom. And I love the for whom. Goals are ambitious and aspirational statements of what all students are expected to achieve. Goal performance measures gauge progress toward a goal and include indicators, data sources, baseline data, and targets. When we were given the challenge here, and our team was given the challenge, and when I say our team, usually it's they give Becky the challenge, and then she says, okay, now guys, let's sit together, here's the direction we want to go. We sat down as a team and thought about, okay, at the inception here of our producing this, a system of support, aligning these initiatives and providing something that's useful and helpful and supportive for our schools, our LEAs, and our provider partners, what do we need to do? So if you look in there, we actually started out with a theory of action for change. So we knew there were things that we had to do differently. We spent apparently, and Becky, you can tell the story, somebody made a copy of this because they liked our theory of change. And so
now the National Center on Systemic Improvement, we had to do a poster session at one of their meetings.
So they created a poster?
They created this for us, but it's our work.
I hope so. So here was our vision statement. to create a school improvement system in which student achievement improves, achievement gaps close, graduation rates increase, and students are college and career ready. Our mission statement, what we do. The Utah State Board of Education, local education agencies, and schools collaboratively develop and implement transparent, systemic transformation to ensure continuous school improvement and educational excellence for each student. We created a theory of action here. At this particular step in the process, we said, okay, so what are our expectations? What are we hoping? If we do this, then this will happen. And if this happens, what we'll eventually have is student achievement improving, achievement gaps close, graduation rates increase, students will be college and career ready. This was a piece, I don't mind telling you, that we hadn't included originally in our handbook. It was a piece after we started discussing this with national agencies that said, you know, we've taken a look at some of the things you've done and we think you're missing a piece here. Set the direction as a step. It's a critical step because it sets the direction. It helps you get up every morning and look at that paper on your nightstand and determine why you're there and where you're headed. So this is a really critical step. Any comments or questions about that? Okay. All right. Step number 2 in the continuous improvement cycle. Assess the needs. So I'm glad that Dr. Shepard's here, and let me tell you a little bit of background there. So in 2017, SB 234 was rolled out. Schools were identified this past year, and then we realized looking at the bill, well, we don't have a board rule yet, so a lot of the stuff that's in there, we're kind of sailing along. One of the things that the board said, or the agency determined, was that, this bill says that you are to contract with an organization separately from your turnaround providers that goes in and does the needs assessment and root cause analysis. So we had to scramble. What we had learned, or what I have learned over this past year, is what that requires is that we have multiple meetings with finance, we have meetings with purchasing and contracts, and then it goes up the ladder for approval. So we started down a pathway in regards to that, and it went south. So we were fortunate enough to know Paul and Annette's work in regards to schools, and so we were lucky that they agreed to take this on in such short notice. We knew there wasn't really anything we could do until the board rule was approved that set aside money to do those things, that allowed us to do those purchases. And so the board rule was approved in November. So this was the schools were identified in the fall, and we didn't have approval to move forward really until the board rule was approved in November. So we contracted with Paul and Annette, and I asked Paul if he wouldn't mind. We'll go through each of the steps in this needs assessment, and I'll get you familiar with the materials that are in there. But if Paul wouldn't mind just kind of talking through the process, what you learned, how that happened.
Sure. Well, and it was like any social system, and anything you do when you're looking at data and you're trying to assess needs and stuff. It's complex and it's messy. So I tend to be. I like to have my data organized in my Excel sheets and linked all over the place and this just was not that kind of process. It was going into school and community environments that had very divergent goals and very different kinds of situations, and then because the whole process was being defined as we were doing it, we were literally trying to change the tire on a car that was moving. So that's, I'm sure that those of you with the schools that I worked with were a little bit frustrated with me because my answer to you was often, I don't know, and I don't know when.
Sounds familiar.
But it was just the nature of what was going on and the way it was coming about. My priority one was to do some meaningful with the needs assessment and root cause analysis that would be useful to you and to your partners down the road. But also, all of you expressed the need to do something in a timely manner because you wanted to get the boat moving. And so that's kind of what we experienced with that. I wrote a couple notes. Forgive me, I'm going to refer to it just because I kind of thought through this quite a bit. And so what I came to understand as I worked with the schools is that just like in a classroom, or just like in school leadership or district leadership or any of those things, the educational interventions that you know work are not always appropriate for the given student or the given school because the contexts are different or the needs are different, hence the importance of a needs analysis. So we note in our needs assessments that we did very divergent environments in which you operate. They're the public charter schools with missions that are different from, not only they vary between the public charter schools, but the governance and the way things are done within those public charters is very different than what's done in public ed. And so we had to look not only at needs in relationship to your turnaround status and what would be why you were in turnaround and what the root causes of that were and how you might address it. We also had to, in my opinion, look at your missions and help you honor those as well. So for example, one school provides online curriculum and their teacher cadre and their students are all over the state from Cache Valley down to St. George. And so you have to take that into account. There's not going to be, you're not going to come in and do school PD in this situation. You're going to have to think very differently. And their needs are very different. Their challenges are going to include tracking and monitoring progress toward graduation with a student population that checks in and out on a click and doesn't tell you where they're at. Several schools seek to provide non-traditional kinds of curriculum, and they're designed to meet the needs of groups of students that haven't been well served necessarily within the public education system. So the solution here would not be have them all conform to public education practices per se, but to find ways for them to meet the requirements that the state has for receiving public funds and to be successful within the context of that non-traditional approach. And that's kind of complex. Some schools exist in umbrellas of larger organizations such as Kennedy within Granite District. And they have different sets of supports that need to be considered. For example, Granite has systems coaches that have been working on an ongoing basis with such schools. And they're already down the road on some things that you might assume would be needed. And so it would be important to collaborate and not have them redo what they've already done. You don't want to start from scratch with them, but you want to look at where they're at and what they've already accomplished and build from that point. Some schools, aware of their turnaround status, have already taken steps and are moving forward. And as some of that has been productive and some of that might have taken a turn one way or another, that the consultants, teams that work with them will just have to rechannel. One school purposely recruits from student populations that are underserved. And they provide additional resources and interventions to help these students not only succeed academically, but to support these families in their need to be successful. And so if you can picture this, they're actually recruiting students to their school that would put them in turnaround status, and they do so willingly. And so that kind of mission needs to be honored and addressed in a way you want them to succeed. In talking with that school, I find that they believe their students can succeed academically, and they want to do their best. So coming in and working with that and honoring again that mission becomes quite a trick. So that's why I think this process, Max and Becky has outlined, of having looking carefully at needs and looking at root causes makes a big difference here. We just can't come in with a cookie cutter approach and say this is what all these schools need to do, and we're going to start with classroom management practices, and then we're going to move it to unpacking curriculum. Utah Virtual is going to need to deal with tracking students and graduation counseling and things like that. Fernando and his school have a very different approach than public education, and they're not wrong in that approach. That they just some of their issues have to do with assessment and how to assess progress and things like that within that, and to they have a school community that needs a lot of communication and buy-in to what they're doing. So assessment, I think, is a big issue with them, and communication of progress and working with the state in that way. So there are all these different kinds of things that require a differentiated approach to these schools. It'd be a mistake to apply cookie cutter kinds of interventions. And what is our role in this process? So what do we do? Well, we did, and you can read through, we did the initial needs assessment and root cause analysis. And we can provide you that. We'd love to sit down with the school and your consultants once they've been selected and review that with you. We also are going to be kind of an independent group that will work with you quarterly in measuring state benchmarks and working. So we'll continue in that process of assessing and reporting, and we want to work collaboratively both with the consultant teams and the school to provide ongoing assessment.
Can we get a little more information
on
that, just so that we know? I struggle a little bit because we're jumping into action with our schools, and I don't want to put something in place that's not going to align perfectly with what you'll be doing, Paul.
And so, I'm sorry, what was the...
My question is, when will we receive more information on the periodic monitoring that you're going to be doing over the course of the next 2 years?
I think we can begin that conversation with phone calls and scheduling some conversations immediately after this.
Okay, that sounds great, thanks.
Okay. The next steps for us are we'd like to meet with you and provide background and share data, and also talk, once you develop your SIPs, I'm assuming that you'll have benchmarks in there and things that you'll be monitoring. So I'd like to work with you on the reporting to include those so that the LEA and the board and the state, we're all on the same pages in what we're monitoring and doing. And then we'll be available for ongoing consultation with the schools as you need us. So if you want us to meet with your school leadership teams or your school turnaround committees, with your boards, or with you as administrators, We are on call for that, and we'll be talking to you at least quarterly about those kinds of things. And that's kind of my thoughts. You know, just like it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a community to with the school and to educate. And I think we were just talking before the meeting, and I referred to you as a consultant. You said, no, we prefer the term partners. I agree with that. I think we're all partners in this process. I will succeed if you succeed, and the school benefits if we're all successful in this process. And then the state's happy, and Max is happy, and the legislature's happy. And
I'm always happy. I don't know anything better. Really the common goal that we share and the common mission that we share is that these schools, that you as a school succeed. Thank you, Paul. And Paul's really, he's playing down the process that we put him through, because we really put a strain on him. We essentially called him up and said, would you be willing to do this work? The process we are going to need you to go through is a very, very draft version with draft versions of these tools and data collection tools and reporting processes that we have to this point. As a matter of fact, the handbook, I think all we had to that point was up to the needs assessment. So we hadn't even proceeded. So they took that and worked with what we gave them in a very short amount of time. So essentially we called them up one day and said, can you have this done yesterday? And so they took that work on and been very appreciative of their patience with us, because the version we have now is a lot of in particular, the needs assessment and root cause analysis is a lot of what we learned through that experience, working with Paul and Annette through that process and their team. So on that note, take a look at this handbook, and let's walk through and just I'll kind of familiarize you with what's in there. The needs assessment in Utah consists of 4 discrete phases. The phases are the collection of quantitative data that's related to those 4 domains. You know what? I digress. You know how many times I had to pluralize or make plural the word data and datum when I wrote my dissertation? So a collection of quantitative data that are related to the 4 domains. Mike Hardman at the University of Utah, be so proud.
I'll send him a note.
Thank you. A collection of qualitative data that are related to the 4 domains, analysis of data and prioritization of needs, and a root cause analysis. So if you take a look, if you flip through those pages again, there's an introduction to all of these things. What are we talking about? What does this mean? This is the information piece. And then it really jumps into a lot of the quantitative data tools. Starting on page 31, you'll notice that in this handbook, this particular section is the biggest piece of it, because we really wanted to make sure, and we learned some things about that data collection, that we had methods and supports in here that would help whoever comes in or whoever comes into the school to conduct the needs assessment or root cause analysis, they would really have a picture of what the school was about, what was happening at that school. So if you just want to flip through those pages, you'll see that in the qualitative and quantitative data collection forms, there are forms to collect information about staffing, demographics, proficiency through the state accountability system, formative assessment proficiency, graduation rates, attendance and behavior incidents, school needs self-assessments, school culture survey, and that's something we picked up from Paul and Annette. Interview protocols and focus group protocols on page 70. You'll see that those are in there, and those changed quite a bit as well. And you'll be happy to know that maybe the process that your folks went through at your school through those focus groups and interviews have been streamlined, wildly streamlined from that, to really get out what we want to know as opposed to asking every question in the book. There's a classroom observation protocol on page 87. And in some of these data collection tools, you can also thank our partner Mitch Nurden, because he was at a number of meetings, stakeholder meetings, getting feedback on these where he said, no, you guys got this way wrong. So we corrected a lot of that stuff. So thank you, Mitch. And all of you who participated in those meetings. If you'll, on page 39 in the book, you'll start to see where we have a huge section of tools where we start to do the analysis of the data. And I referenced this a little bit earlier this morning. We were talking about it. You'll notice that as you flip through those rubrics, that those rubrics are based on the domains, the practice under that domain, and then an indicator. So what we're really looking at is measuring how that indicator, how that practice is being implemented in that school. And there's a rating there. Those rubrics contain all the evidence. Well, I'm not going to read it all to you. You can see where those things come in there. And there are a lot of ways. They go through each of the 4 domains, the practices under those domains, and the indicators of each of those practices. I lost my notes. On page 93, in that particular section, we have a data crosswalk tool to try to organize all this stuff. And then around page 97, I think, you'll see that there's a data analysis and needs prioritization tool to really start to boil down that data, to really get at what are the strengths here? What are things that should continue and be celebrated? And then if we're starting to look at areas where we need to drill down a little farther and start to look at, okay, why is this happening here? What's an area that we can make the greatest impact? The root cause analysis section's on page 102, and I'm sure if you haven't seen some of these tools and some of these processes, you will, because they're pretty prevalent. Whether it be for root cause analysis, whether it be the fishbone diagram. I mean, this is the one I've seen a lot of going through this process. And on the subsequent page, there's the 5 whys. These are just kind of universal strategies for doing root cause analysis. Any comments, questions through that needs assessment process? You know, you've gone through this. You've had this done. Paul's team is going to be available as these plans, as you're starting to develop your plans, to sit down and kind of really clarify or decipher. He showed us the mountains of data that they did collect. I remember Paul calling me up and asking me for something. I had no idea what he was talking about. So there was a lot of that, things that we learned through that process. Anything on this before we move on? What's the count time? 30 seconds? I'm the worst at the 30-second wait. Okay, the next step is where you are. Our 5 schools. You've conducted your RFPs, you've contracted with your school turnaround partner, and now it's this process of plan development based on the needs assessment and root cause analysis. Interestingly enough, I added this slide in here because I went back as I was preparing for today and read through all the materials, the board rule, the law, and the board rule doesn't mention this, but the law does. It actually has steps. It says these things are required in a school improvement plan. And these are the bullet points that the actual bill says, SB 234. It says that it addresses the root causes of the low-performing schools' low performance identified through the needs assessment. That means, that plan has to, by point, if it's listed as a root cause in that school, there has to be a piece of that plan that addresses it. It includes recommendations regarding changes that may be necessary to implement the school improvement plan, includes measurable student achievement goals, objectives, benchmarks, professional development plan, a detailed budget, a plan to assess and monitor progress, and a timeline for implementation. So those are the pieces that are in there that are required. In the book, in the handbook, under Create the Plan, the school improvement plan is developed based on the results of the needs assessment and root cause analysis. The school improvement plan includes strategies, effective evidence-based practices, milestones or implementation indicators, and actions, steps to those milestones. If you'll, in those materials on the left side of that book, of the handbook, we included, Becky Peters made copies of that guidance. Schools that are identified for school improvement under Title I are required in their plan to utilize evidence-based practices or strategies to address the root causes that have been identified in their schools. It is the expectation of the board that your plans will also intend to utilize evidence-based practices to address the root causes that were identified through the needs assessment process in your school. So if you take a look in that guidance, I believe it's on page 7, kind of gives you the thumbnail definition of what those mean. And having said this, I think I mentioned that I participated in this cycle of webinars that were hosted by the Department of Education in an attempt to clarify for states what exactly evidence-based practices were. They referred a lot back to this guidance, and the guidance utilizes various levels of what that means. They use these terms. You can see in that little box it says, what is an evidence-based intervention? It says, strongest, demonstrates statistically significant effect on improving student outcomes or other relevant outcomes based on strong evidence from at least one well-designed and well-implemented experimental study. The other is moderate evidence, at least one well-designed quasi-experimental study. And if you've taken statistics, experimental means you're randomly selected to a control group or the other group that's being tested. Quasi-experimental means you're not necessarily doing a random selection, you're assigning groups. Then the next level will be promising evidence from at least well-designed and well-implemented correlational study with statistical controls. I just want to say that when I took statistics for my doctoral program, I hired a tutor that sat with me every day in those classes, so these terms are familiar. And then this other level here demonstrates a rationale based on a high-quality research finding or positive evaluation that such activity, strategy, or intervention is likely to improve student outcomes or other relevant outcomes. One of the things that we've discussed, and I'll, Becky, pipe in when I go completely off the rails here, but we have really qualified people here in this agency. We have an entire section that works with language arts. We have an entire section that works with math and science, equity and English language acquisition. Those seem to be big chunks of things that a lot of times get identified. Those folks work tirelessly to understand and research out the best evidence-based practices, and we can get, if you need contact with those folks for particular strategies based on those areas, we can certainly do that. What we'll really be looking for as plans are developed, go through the process of approval, review and approval, is that where there's a root cause, that there is something that is close to that definition of evidence-based as a strategy as we can get. Sometimes we know that there might not be something that is specific out there that addresses something in your context. So we can pursue that. Anything say additionally to that?
Now, and our plan here is we're hiring some additional staff for our team. And one of my goals is to put together a committee that includes external stakeholders as well as our internal staff to begin looking at the kinds of resources we can put together and provide to LEAs in schools, because it's all about return on investment, as that title says. It's about how are we using these dollars that are coming to us to benefit students. That's the bottom line. And not spending money on things that are just not going to make a difference. And we know, decades of Title I, some schools don't really spend their money very effectively, and so we're going to be looking more closely at at that, but the kind of technical assistance and support that we can provide as a state. And I just went to a meeting in Washington, D.C. the last week of July with people from the other states across the nation. They're all grappling with this. A few states have put together some guidance documents. Washington State for many years has had pages on its website with lists of reading things that they had approved and math things they had approved. There are some national websites. Robert Slavin at Johns Hopkins University developed a website specifically for the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is called Evidence for ESSA. And right now he's got things for reading and math, but they're all published programs. They're not individual practices or strategies that a teacher might implement or a school might implement. They're programs.
He has his best evidence memos as well.
Yeah, and there are also other documents we're putting together. So we'll put together some guidance, some links to national websites that do have information available in various areas, and do the best that we can to get some technical assistance developed and out to LEAs during this year.
Yeah, it occurred to me, and Becky was kind enough to share Bob Slavin's his slides and some of his materials, and I'd also seen him speak before in regards to evidence for ESSA, that resource. This term evidence-based practices isn't a new one. One of the things I do in my spare time is I sit on a board with my wife. It's the National Association for Mental Illness, and the first meeting I went to, they talked extensively about evidence-based practices, and I thought, that's interesting. As I pursued it a little further, I found that it's a term that's used in business a lot. So education is kind of now coming around to adopting the term and understanding that this is what it means. We want to do what we know works. And when we're talking about the achievement for our students, we want to make sure that we're not always trying stuff out, that we're actually going to do things right off the get-go that are going to work for them and create those systems that do that too.
This is Dr. Leah Voorhees. She's our Assistant Superintendent of Student Support, and our team, the team that I lead, we work under her direction. But one of her emphasis for this year as well is to make sure that things coming out of this office are evidence-based. And when people are presenting at conferences or providing opportunities for professional learning, meetings, and other kinds of things that are being set up under the umbrella of this agency, that's always going to be something that needs to be at the forefront. We can't just spend money on things that really aren't going to make any difference. So we appreciate her being here. She was instrumental. She assisted with the development of our theory of action, and so thank you for coming.
Sorry I'm late. Been in other meetings, but I appreciate you all being here.
But the reason we really invited her because she sings an amazing version of Amazing Grace. So I'd like to turn it.
It's not nearly caffeinated enough for that.
Okay, having said all that, take a look in the handbook there under that tab and kind of walk you through some of the pieces there. So speaking of strategies, evidence-based, based on those root causes, milestones and action steps, you'll see that there's more definition there. There's a little more introduction with information. And then we've actually put in just kind of a school improvement plan template example. Kind of walk through, if this were the case in regards to this a particular school, this is what it might look like. Following that, there's a school improvement plan template. One of the reasons that we are asking schools to follow the template is because they have to be reviewed and approved. And going through those and making sure that that is done equitably, same for one plan that's submitted as opposed to another plan, we want them to be in the same format. So on page, let's see. One of the things that I thought was kind of was really, so one of the things we just added in here upon request was we put in there a 90-day plan template to help organize that as you move forward. We also put in, which I thought was really cool, and I was glad that it ended up in here, on page, looks like 119. And it says only for first semester, but it was a plan to identify up to 4 specific actions that will make the quick win plan happen. And I was glad that was there because it's pretty easy through a process like that to start really focusing on, oh, we have to do this, and we have to do this, and we have to do this. And this is one of these things where we can stop and go, okay, we know we're making progress, and how can we do that? And let's plan to do that. Let's plan to make a quick win progress. I was just excited about that. I was glad that it was in there. Then at the very end there, in that tab, there's a 90-day plan development and reflection tool. So you've got to the end of the 90-day plan. Let's stop and take a look at what we've accomplished, what still needs to be done, and what successes we've had there. So I've referred to this a couple of times, and I'll draw your attention to this slide, but there's a requirement under the board rule, under the bill, that once the plan is developed, that it is submitted to the local board or the governing board to approve or deny in whole or part that plan. So they take a look at it and determine whether it addresses the root causes in that school, whether it satisfies for that particular definition of evidence-based. It's a strategy that's going to work. Once the governing board or local board approves that plan, it is submitted to the USBE for review or approval. And same thing, in whole or part. Becky and Lee and I met recently to talk about, we understand school starts here in a couple of weeks and you folks are under a huge crunch. We are committed to turning that around. So we will put together a cross-agency group to review the plans, and we're committed to turning those around really quickly. We're even more committed that if there's a piece of that plan or all of that plan that needs to be reviewed or tweaked, that when it's resubmitted, we'll turn it around even quicker. That's what we decided. Specifically, the law says these kinds of things. What it does say is the board may not approve a school turnaround plan that is not aligned with the needs assessment. So we will actually have that report up there. We'll be looking at it and determining whether the plan addresses what was identified in the needs assessment. And yes, in parts we may need some clarification. We will have hopefully access to Paul and Annette to kind of clarify some of those things, and with the schools as well.
What if we've collected additional data from the school? How will that be used to inform the plan?
So, and I'm going to open that up here for that decision. Just my personal thought would be that this would be something that would be worked out through the process with Paul and Annette as you kind of have those conversations. Say, this is what you collected. We've collected additional pieces. Does it fit in there? Any thoughts from this end of the table in regards to that?
Yeah, I agree. And in conjunction with the administration of the school.
Right. And the turnaround committee.
Well, the schools are requesting that additional data, so.
Okay, yeah, and through that process.
But legally, the plan definitely has to address the needs assessment and the root causes.
That's not what I'm asking. I'm just asking if there's additional data, how that will be used. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we can work with you collaboratively on that. It seems to me that as these school improvement plans push forward, there are going to be benchmarks and indicators that aren't anticipated, and we need to be flexible in that and work with you on that in reporting.
For example, a couple of the schools have had a large change in staff, and so who you observed is not even there anymore.
Exactly. So establishing baselines is problematic to begin with.
Okay.
Well, and I'm thinking in terms of inputs. I mean, we have to measure inputs as well as outputs, and so we've got to do some thoughtful discussion and working on all that out.
Yeah, the bill is really specific about that. You know, the plan needs to be aligned to that needs assessment, but there's no way that the agency is going to be rigid, so rigid that what we're not doing or we're getting in the way of developing a plan that really addresses the needs of the school is going to make the biggest impact. So I would agree with what Paul said. We can be flexible there as long as ultimately what the plan is doing is addressing what has been identified as the root causes in that school.
And the state has given us a set of tools and things that they require us to report on a quarterly basis. And so we will be using those and implementing those in addition to what's going on with the SIP.
And in that last bullet there, the funding for under this bill for the schools, it's dependent upon the approval of the school. So essentially what the wording in the bill says is once the plan is approved by the board, and the board is capital B, it's the state board, once that plan is approved, then the funds will be allocated to the LEA.
Allocated and released, I'm guessing.
Yeah. I say yeah like I just speaking for the entire agency. And when I say yeah,
it doesn't always work that way.
Like I've mentioned a couple of times, a lot of time what that means is we've got to have the entire finance staff, purchasing contracts, and we've got to sit down and work through all those details. So I say yeah really flippantly, Richard, but...
Well, it's going to affect how we interact within our organization. So.
Yeah, understood. Okay. So that's plan development. Are there any additional things? So that next step is, and Becky alluded to that we will have a new staff member that will be working with us on our team for school improvement. The person that we're going to be working with that we've hired, we're excited because she's quite knowledgeable in implementation science. So she's going to be a really good resource when we get to these stages moving forward. As you'll take a look in that next tab, of implementation plan, it really lines out. There's some introduction, there's some verbiage about what we're talking about and what you might want to consider as you moving forward with preparation. There are these stages that are really detailed through implementation, exploration. And I'm not going to read these to you. You can look through those resources. Exploration, installation, initial implementation, full implementation, innovation, sustainability. These are parts of the implementation science that, as you know, this step is really where the rubber hits the road. You can make the most fabulous plan in the world, but if you don't implement it correctly, then it really is not going to gain traction. So this step is also pretty critical. And if anybody has any comments about that, so continuing on under this tab, monitoring the work, and this is a piece that there's some interesting language in the bill. It isn't brought up in the rule, but the bill specifies in these particular sections. It says that once you've selected your turnaround expert partner, that a piece of one of the things that is included in that contract is that they will monitor the effectiveness of a school turnaround plan through reliable means of evaluation, including on-site visits, observations, etc. Then it also says in a subsequent section that the board, and when it says the board is talking about this agency, USBE, will monitor and assess progress towards the goals, benchmarks, and timetable in each school turnaround plan. So we've addressed that here in the handbook with some suggested methods and some protocols and some tools that can be used for that. One of the things that the handbook suggests for your school turnaround committee that you can do in regards to progress is it says one of the things you can do is a bi-weekly check, just a monitoring visit to check in, and it details what that might look like. And then it also talks about a school leadership monitor and reporting, where you meet with the leadership of the team and you discuss, this is who's in charge, this is what they've done, or this is what they still need to do, this is the progress that we're making as we go through this currently. And if you flip through that particular section, you'll see that we've got some tools that can help organize that particular monitoring and evaluation. This second piece for the state, what was suggested to us, and we worked through our leadership, we worked through the whole finance section was in on helping us with this decision, but for the board piece of it to monitor and assess progress towards the goals, what we're doing is extending our contract with Observer Tab with Paul and Matt. So they had conducted the needs assessment and root cause analysis. They're going to be the ones that come in quarterly to determine progress towards the particular goals that were in the plan that address the root causes. So we're going to continue that work with them. They'll be there for the next 2 years for that evaluation and progress. Any questions about any of that? Or any further comments or something I didn't clarify or touch upon? Well, good. I must be fantastic over here. Just rambling on and on. But I don't have any more stories, so at least there's that.
I think you'll find most of us are nervous to talk or ask questions to somebody who uses fluorescent cheese. So.
Yeah. It was the only, I finally did catch some fish on it though, so I was just wrong, I think. Okay, this final tab, step 6, adjusting the course. What's this? This is the final tab in the book here. The improvement cycle is iterative and ongoing and provides multiple opportunities for adjustments and implementation. Schools and LEAs may decide to make adjustments based on quarterly monitoring. At the very least, school and LEA leaders should on an annual basis do these things. Collect and analyze the performance measures originally identified for each strategy under the domains that we're focused on. Review milestones and examine those that have not been completed. Adjust milestones and strategies based on data as needed. And then I think starting on page 146 in the handbook, we have some actual tools that can be utilized for that. And there's a number of those. And so that's the 6th step of the improvement cycle, centered on the 4 domains for reputable improvement. So before I move off of the improvement cycle, are there any comments or questions or discussion? It was a lot of stuff.
Yeah, so I may become persona non grata here in Utah, but I'm going to bring up some things that I have questions about. So I'm going to bring the lens. I was a school turnaround principal. I turned around 2 schools in my past, and now I work for an organization that does that with schools as an outside partner. And one of the things that I'm sort of thinking about is both from the root cause, and I'll start there, having a sympathetic view to a school leader's perspective, and saying that I don't doubt the expertise that you bring in, but also from an outsider perspective, we're really careful about identifying a root cause that may not have actually been a root cause, or have some thought about things that are essential to the school that may be on that day or on that week that show up as problems. And I know your science probably certainly goes deeper than that, but from a school perspective, I think there is it might present a disconnect to both the actual data that is on the ground, and then having an external report on the school, and then being held to that. And I'm just wondering if there's some thoughts around how that negotiation happens. So let me be clear with my perspective is both as, if I might, as a school principal or a school head of school, looking at that root cause and saying, okay, so is there an opportunity to then have some give and take and really identify maybe the priority routes or priority needs, and then some flexibility on how on the obviously on the intervention, and then how to measure progress towards that. Just putting that out there. I don't know if there's answers to that or.
I would respond that I think the piece that Max just covered most recently about adjust adjusting the course, it presupposes that kind of process. That obviously the initial root cause that or causes that were identified going forward are a snapshot in time, and in a social context that is going to evolve and change, and that should be adjusted.
Yeah.
And I think that would be part of the a discussion between you as the partner and the LEA and our team, so that we're all on the same page with that. But I think, yeah, obviously I think there's move for adjustment in the current context.
And then it's sort of on the larger side, I'm going to dig my hole even deeper here. From a turnaround plan. So I also had the privilege of being the, put out my full credential here, working for John King in New York as the turnaround guy. So I had oversight of turnaround and charters for New York for several years. And one of the things that we often struggled with was sort of that plan being a document like this, and then not having life behind it. And I'm wondering, just from, again, there are processes, and I understand the law dictates a lot of this, but if we can be thoughtful about that plan as a living document, one, up front, I think that's really helpful to schools and districts, but also to the state in thinking about how best to intervene or how best to help schools get better at various parts of either, we like to call it a design, so it doesn't necessarily have dates tied to it or check marks, but really thinking about how making room for intervention, making room for those course corrections on a daily basis even, and because we don't want a kid to have what's in front of them. We wouldn't do this in the classroom where we have something in front of that kid and say, read it, no, I said read it, when they can't get that. So, and making sure that the intervention is appropriate to that student's specific needs. Has that translation then to being a good partner and a good intervener from a human perspective of things change on a day-to-day basis, while staying focused on a strategy that is going to attend to that.
Great comment. And I guess some of the role that I took today was to say, well, the intention of the legislature and the school board and the agency is kind of wrap the conversation around, they're trying to align initiatives so that there isn't a double burden on a school that has to satisfy one bill or another bill. But there's flexibility within that. The intention is that we're going to design a system that's going to best serve that kid that day in that school. So that's a really good point. We hope that moving forward that we're going to construct systems that will have that perspective and implement strategies that take into consideration those changes. So we're not rigid in, you develop this plan on day one, you got to stick to it. This is as Paul said, this is a starting point. This is a point in time. So here's where we're going to start. We have to start somewhere. We're going to start here. But there are processes in place to go back and review that, adjust that course if it needs to happen that way. We want the best for the kids at all costs, so that's where we're moving forward.
I would argue too then, just as my last ditch-digging effort here.
You're amongst friends.
Okay, good. I appreciate that. So, from a plan perspective or a design perspective, where it is really helpful for us, and I probably am saying something that you already know, but is that the quantitative target of increasing proficiency in reading and math, having that target always be the target, and then allowing the strategies to get there shift, or the implementation of those strategies to shift, as long as the target is being met. and being progressed. So that's a perspective that I hope is useful.
Well, I appreciate those comments.
Or not.
Because no, it's you know, a lot of times things come up, and I'll tell you, it's past number of months, there are so many questions that you guys have brought up that either come in by email or I get a phone call. First off, I mean, my first line is to go over to Becky and go, what am I supposed to do here? And then she talks me off the ledge, and then we go through that process. So I appreciate those kinds of things because it really does guide thinking and conversation. Though I will admit, sometimes it does slow it down, but it's good because it broadens the perspective and ultimately provides a better system. So I appreciate those comments. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah, and in reality, I mean, any kind of data we're gathering, there's a summative point where you want to see increased proficiency in mathematics and English language arts, but in a formative way, it's a diagnostic and a prescriptive approach. You're looking at things on a day-to-day and month-to-month basis, and then making course adjustments as you go based on what the new diagnoses are, what the data is telling you. So, I mean, if this isn't evolutionary, then we're not doing our jobs.
Thank you, Paul.
Just a question along that line. So, and since you were digging a ditch, let me not dig a grave, okay? So,
It's warm down there.
well,
Or cool.
grave to ledge, I guess. So, since these plans limit the amount and places in which funding can be aligned, this presupposes then that can change as the plan, so it's dynamic in the sense of how that works. Am I?
Well, this is part of, I mean, this next slide, that's a pretty good transition, so I'll talk about this. Here was something that was kind of new and different for me. The board rule stipulates, or it puts a number on the school's identified as initial allocation of $240,000. There are these additional criteria if it's at a distance, if they have a secondary school and they have so many FTE, and the elementary school they have so many FTE. If you've done any math, you realize that the allocation from the state for state school turnaround is $7 million. $240,000 times 5 doesn't equal $7 million or anywhere close to it, so there's going to be a piece out there. Because the board stipulated $240,000, it's a starting point. Now, we are in conversations. We've met with Natalie Grange, who is our assistant superintendent over finance. We've met with purchasing and contracts to talk about this. That leaves a chunk out there. The issue we have moving forward is it's undefined, so it's labeled as carry forward funds. What we are working with right now is determining whether it's going to require some adjustments in the language in the board rule to determine what to do with that and how to allocate those funds. The conversation we had is that it would be based on, as we go out to do progress monitoring towards the objectives and the goal, that there would be additional needs that come up or requirements under that, and then what will that process be for schools and LEAs to apply for that additional piece of it. So yes, it's on our mind, it's in the conversation, we're just figuring out the process of how that could be. However, having said that, whatever those funds would be allocated towards must be tied to the objectives in the plan and the root causes moving forward.
Moving forward, or
Even
dynamically?
if those dynamically, they still have to be tied to
So,
that.
so in essence, if the plan were to change 6 months later and a new need is determined that aligns with a funding request, that would be acceptable. So it's not the initial, I guess what I'm saying is it's not necessarily the initial need, it's the dynamic need as it progresses.
We don't know yet. So that's still under conversation because there is that chunk of money that is carried forward funds. It still has to be determined whether it's going to require a board rule and then the process involved. So I don't know.
And I think my request would only
your
be
point
that,
is taken.
Yeah, that ultimately, in order for us to best be able to accomplish what we're looking to do, we would need to have that flexibility. So,
thank you. Point taken.
The board rule did say that there would be money available and that the superintendent could allocate that money based on your
What
plan.
it says is dependent upon funds from the legislature. Then it just lists. So the context, and you're right, it does say the superintendent, dependent upon funds, can allocate, and then it says, at a minimum.
Yeah, there is those minimum things.
The context for that is we have things that are being finalized for Cohort 1. So that's indeterminate. We don't know where those things go. So at a minimum, as a starting point, because the board rule says it, we can at least do that. Without Finance's recommendation was that we hold off on allocating anything until all of the money that needs to be allocated for Cohort 1 is completed. So that's where we said, no, we draw the line here, we at least need to start. So yeah, though.
Because as we're writing the plan, this initial go for the plan, I see a real need for additional resources to implement the plan. For example, our contract is we're spending $240,000 on the outside provider, and there is need for implementation costs, PD that the teachers have to attend, those types of things that it would be great to get. I mean, we also need to pony up out of our own pockets, but the money is there, so it seems like it would be. And I get where you're going. You got to kind of deal with it.
Yeah, just the designation of that piece of funds is designated as flow through to the turnaround schools and LEAs for use of implementation of the plan. It's just the process, the procedure, and the legalities of that are still under construction. We're just kind of in between one thing and the other. We're trying to get it situated so we can move forward confidently. Is there anything that I missed in that piece of that?
No, I think both of your questions / thoughts are very reasonable.
Yeah.
But we also have an enormous amount of bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Just one comment about that.
Please.
One of the big challenges we face is that we also have a timeline by which we have to live. And so any delay, and this has been something that we've dealt with since the beginning of this process, any delay because of the bureaucracy that you go through, and I fully recognize the challenge there. But where the tire really hits the road is us.
Yeah.
And so where the consequence will really align itself with the future is at our level. And so, that becomes a real frustration to us because we're not seeing any extension of time for us based on delays through the bureaucracy. And yet we also, in many of our cases, have limited resources in which to be able to implement things. So that's just a huge challenge that I think there's not a solution to other than to expedite as much as possible the ability for us to have access to those resources and to a dynamic plan that can ultimately allow us to utilize those funds in the most advantageous method.
And I kind of do a foot stamp on what you're saying too. Is another aspect to this delay has been it's got staff and community in turmoil because their expectation is to move forward and do something immediately, and so having the brakes on while waiting for the funding sources and everything to be aligned are creating a lot of uncertainty and frustration with communities.
We definitely can improve on getting out of our own way. So it's a point taken. Yeah, absolutely. I can certainly I'll speak for myself, and I think I do speak for the rest of our crew here, is that we have gotten louder and more urgent. So I think things are starting to move a little faster. So it's now become, no, look, you're dealing with us right now. So it's improving. So thank you, Richard, for those comments. We'll continue to take that message too. So thank you.
It's completely valid.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're here every day. We see it. So let me just talk about the timeline. I mentioned it earlier. So as soon as local boards and your governing boards approve your plans and they're submitted to us, we will move as quicker than we originally said. We'll move as fast as possible to get these committees to review and approve. and then the funds are tied to the approval of that. So we're going to get that facilitated and expedited. There's a piece on there, I, in quotation marks, put criteria funds. There's some criteria on top of the $240,000. A question has come in about, well, so how do we apply for those particular funds? Those will automatically be determined by USBE or Data and Statistics, and through finance, those will be added to the grants management system automatically. So you won't need to apply for those additional funds, they'll just be in there. And then I think we talked quite extensively about just those carry forward funds and where we are.
Are they going to be in UCA this year or in Utah Grants?
That's a good question.
That's a good question.
Yeah, some of our federal programs are going to be applied for in the UCA, but then reimbursed through the new system. And then next year, everything will be in the new system. So, yeah, they're adding pieces and parts on a daily basis and trying to open up various funding streams. Because this is state funding, I'm assuming it will be in the new system.
I think so too.
Yes. Because you won't be doing really an application in there. Your application is really your
It's just kind of flow through
identified.
money, so it's reimbursement. So it
Yeah,
would be in
yeah.
grants. Makes sense.
But I could be wrong, so,
Yeah, so-
tomorrow will be something else.
We've already got accustomed to that.
Yeah, I know.
Not that you're wrong, but the
Yeah,
things change
but
tomorrow.
things change on a daily basis.
And then and it's okay, if you have any more questions or comments regarding that, it's the last thing I wanted to touch on is that we've been putting together frequently asked questions document. It's on the website. It changes. I think I sent in a bunch of changes, updated. So there's quite a pathway in that website to get to it. I put it on here, but if you go in and start looking for those frequently asked questions and you can't find them, just send me an email or give me a call and I'll direct you to where those are. We started that frequently asked questions for those of you who participated when we had that conference call that somehow got limited to 16 participants and everybody else got locked out. But regardless, we got a lot of information there, and we started to put together frequently asked questions. It's organized by topic and the questions you've asked, and then the responses that we've given in there. It will be updated. It's got some edits that still need to take place from the one I submitted, so it'll be changing. So, having said that, one thing I can appreciate, and I said it at the beginning, and I want to say it again, is that I've never had the experience when I've touched bases with you or we've talked where you haven't been kind to me in even in the context of what's been going on. So the times that I specifically remember standing up at Lyft at the beginning of the year, and while everybody was out there, and I got to stand up there, I think, for about 15, 20 minutes and go, I don't know. It's a good question. Well, I'll write that one down. That's a good question, too. So we've come pretty far. I was pretty excited today because we actually had something that we could give you and say, we do know some things here. There are still things that we don't, and there are some things that we've got some ideas. We're moving forward. As fast as we know, we'll get things out to you. Again, I think it's been brought up on a number of times. This whole process is dynamic. Things change. Really appreciate your feedback, and if you have, even if you drive away or as the weeks go by and you have additional feedback, please share it with us. We're all in this together. We all want the same thing. If we didn't, I don't think we'd be sitting here at the table.
Max, can I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah, is that okay?
Just so I can quit talking.
Okay.
I'm tired of myself.
So one of the practices in here has to do with alignment, right? And so the curiosity is, as we plan and build will and capacity for alignment, there's a new assessment system that's coming. And so the sooner, understanding the constraints of bureaucracy, the sooner we understand that system, as soon as there's clarity, we're able to enact this practice of alignment at a much greater level that could have more efficient and urgent impact. So my question is, when will we know, have more clarity on the RISE assessment system, more concrete specificity?
As opposed to just the initial...
Ambiguity.
Yeah.
Ambiguity is part of making this work, when we get information that could be delayed, that's okay, we'll make it work. The sooner we get that information about the assessment system, especially related to specific priority strategies based on root cause. Thinking about you guys, and so, you know, just wondering when we might know more.
We all look at Leah.
So yesterday,
Yeah.
I'm scanning my eyes around. I'm going to you and Leah.
To see that I'm looking at Leah.
licensed educator
Yeah.
in the state of Utah received an email from the superintendent yesterday outlining the new assessment system.
Yes, and Mark Peterson
Yesterday.
sent out a press release.
There was
as
also
well.
a press release.
This is cool.
And so it explains RISE. It's basically still going to be using the items that were developed in Utah with Utah teachers' involvement that were designed for SAGE. It will be a different vendor,
Different platform,
different
same
class,
items.
yeah, different vendor, but it'll still be, you know, computer adaptive. And then it also gives an explanation of the ACT Aspire Plus.
Utah ACT Aspire Plus,
You know, that's what I'm asking.
Which
which is the
yeah.
9 and 10
Yeah.
assessment.
Same page.
Which is a hybrid
So-
of ACT Plus based on Utah standards, which will be like a unique system
Utah
for
items.
the nation. Yes, with
Yeah.
Utah items.
So clarity decreases anxiety on a system, and it allows a system to be able to move forward, which is amazing, right? So if we're sitting in a planning meeting, where would we go to find the information you just shared?
All of that information.
All of that information.
Every bit plus more,
Yeah.
Okay.
plus some context.
Yeah.
Because what the superintendent sent was
Summary.
bullet points,
Mhm.
right? Is on the assessment webpage,
Yes.
the USBE assessment webpage. And
Great.
Darren Nielsen has been going around the state and will continue to be going around the state providing director level presentations to every group, every
Yeah.
type of director that we have in the system. Last
Title
week he
I
talked to special ed directors. He's on the agenda for curriculum directors,
Title.
title directors. But all of the information already exists on the assessment webpage and was press released and sent to every educator in the state yesterday.
Since we're asking clarifying questions, thinking about monitoring for Cohort 2, but thinking about Cohort 3 and Cohort 1, when are grade? I assume we're going to have to do grades because of turnaround. They might not be published publicly, but we'll know school grades, right?
Correct. Well, it's not necessarily a grade because we're looking at 3%, but the analysis will
Yeah.
be done. Correct.
Yeah, right.
Right.
So we'll have points. Who cares about the grade? And be able to identify. And that won't happen until December?
Yep.
Is that right? Am I
That's
saying
for
that
all
right?
schools. Been in conversation with data statistics, evaluation, and assessment because part of the board rule stipulates that it's this phrase you've heard a couple of times, what gets you in is what gets you out. So schools for Cohort 1 identified in 2014-2015 have to
Based
be
on that.
based on that particular weighting system. So they've determined, or they're working through a method to be able to release that kind of information for Cohort 1 schools earlier than November.
To
So
us
that-
and Cohort 1.
Yes,
Yes,
not
it won't be.
not statewide,
yeah,
but
right.
public.
Yeah.
Cohort 1 schools will know they're out
Yeah.
maybe in
Yes.
October, is that what you're saying?
Oh, yeah,
Groovy.
or sooner, hopefully.
Well, and
Yeah, as soon as we have our hands on that data, we will do that
Yeah.
analysis.
so then, you said wait, so maybe we should wait for this question, but
Well, and I can, if you don't want to hear this stuff, I appreciate you being here. You don't have to, or we can, we're hanging around. We've got the room for a little bit longer, so we're available just to
Yes.
talk. So that was all the stuff that I really wanted to share with you to walk through that handbook and some of those questions that we had. And I was just excited to have something without I don't know.
that has got to be exciting.
It was pretty exciting.
So Cohort 1, let's just say it's October. If a school doesn't get out at that moment, we begin the process to try to apply for an extension, and that will be outlined before that date, or
Yeah, and it actually, if you go into that board rule, it does outline there's a qualification.
Sure, we
So,
understand all the,
Yeah.
what's in the board.
But yes, that will be part of that process. So because some of it means, well, how do we go through that process of applying for those funds?
Yeah.
And so, yes.
You'll have that outline. Do we anticipate that there will be a requirement to continue to work with an outside provider? And if so, will there be funds associated, or will you just tell the outside provider, hey, look, you didn't get your second half of the money, so stay with them, and then if you get out 2 years down the road, you can get your second half of the money? I don't know what you're all considering.
It's a good question. We have discussed it. I don't think we've determined exactly, because so we worked with a partner for 3 years and we didn't get out, or do we still have to continue with that partner, or don't we? It's still under discussion, I think. But yeah, I think that the bill actually ties funds to that as a continuation.
Yes.
I don't know what that looks like, but
There is some funding, is that what you're saying?
the bill stipulates
Yeah.
that there is, and finance is planned for it.
Groovy.
Yeah, and so those continuation requests will come from the LEA, not from the providers. We do know that for sure. So it's just depending how it all works.
Fernando.
My question is regarding contracts with our third-party experts. Are there specifications on a timeline for that, or is that done through the board? Does our school board have to, is that a contract with our school board, or is it with the school, the administrators, et cetera, et cetera?
That's a super good question. The change in this iteration of the bill, the funding comes through USBE directly to the LEA, who conducts that RFP and then that contract. So there are probably some procurement requirements in there. The bill stipulates, it says the contract will have certain things in it. If you go back and look at it, it lists them. Beyond that, that's a really good question. Does anybody
So the issue is if I understand your question correctly, the answer to your question would be based on your school's procurement process.
Right.
If because we will give you, the school, the money,
Okay.
right? Then you, as the school, if your
You give it
board,
to the LEA.
Yeah.
yeah, right.
Yeah, and in
Yes.
your
You're
case,
a school and
yeah.
an LEA,
Yeah.
right? So if your
Yeah, the
process is that the
your
board,
LEA.
your contracts, makes the contracts, then that's what would need to happen.
Okay.
If your process is that the administrator can enter into a contract, then you'd be able to do that. But many LEAs, the LEA enters into contracts.
Yeah.
Schools
Not
do
the
not
school.
enter into contracts, but some school districts, which
set up
doesn't
that way.
apply to you, but some school districts allow schools to enter into contracts as well. So that would be based on your procurement rules.
Is there a deadline? We're already working with a company, but we're not, we haven't finalized our official contract yet.
This is wildly just like, I think logically it would be the work should begin when the contract is complete. So you want to have the I's dotted and the T's
As
crossed.
soon as possible.
Yes.
So if the work began before, we just don't.
But
And again, like Leah said, that it's a procurement process it's specific to that particular LEA. So
the problem with your concept is that in order for a contract to be executed, money has to change hands. And we're not getting the money until the plan's written. And we have to write the plan with the outside provider.
and
So
again,
there
it
has
would
to
be
be
that procurement process for your individual LEA. We have a really strict purchasing contracts director who is really specific, and he's told us a number of times when we've tried to pursue or provide guidance or instruction on that kind of thing, that money that process is for that individual LEA. So we can't be in there telling them what to do with it.
Has to be based on your procurement rules.
Thank you.
If I can make one comment for the next cohort, you may want to change that. You may want to take it back to where contractually things are done through with the help of the board, because particularly if you're a charter school, you lack some of the expertise to be able to do that easily. And so I think allowing us to be involved in the decision was a a very smart move. I think asking us to take on all of those other roles is ultimately problematic.
Good point. It's a great question. We did learn that, and it would take a change in legislation for that to occur, because that's actually in the bill. But one thing that we have discussed moving forward is we can provide professional learning opportunities with
Technical assistance.
technical assistance in that process.
With our purchasing.
It was brought up this year, and I wouldn't have known until Richard, you make that comment, because
we actually contracted someone to put ours together, because if you look at the requirements, they're fairly difficult to meet, and they're to make sure that we're covering everything, and we have not executed ours yet. So Holly, now you know that it's coming still, but so yeah,
We'll just keep working with you.
Yeah, ultimately, and that's how we look at it, right? Is that it's a partnership.
We're there every week. It's good.
Yeah, and so this is a long-term partnership, and we understand that it's going to be a long-term thing. But I would say for other organizations in the future, other charter schools particularly, as a district, this is much less problematic, because you have a department that, and frankly, lawyers on staff that do this. We don't.
Right.
And so I would just say, if you even put together some sort of a general contract that covers everything and that you can plug in some of the specific pieces, you're going to find that I think your charter schools will be far more successful in meeting your requirements and expectations.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
So you hired a person, or you hired a contractor to help you write the contract. Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
So you had to pay for outside help.
Yes.
To be able to implement the procurement process.
Yes.
We did as well. We hired.
You did as well.
Yeah, so we don't want to
That's
have a burden.
very interesting, and thank you for telling us. That's very
And that's what
helpful.
we're considering.
You're
because
considering.
We're so unfamiliar with.
It sure seems like they could just, in part of technical assistance, say, state, help us do this.
Yes.
We'll be partners with you. We'll take on the fiduciary responsibility, but you'll guide us the whole way.
Yes, and I think.
I mean, an LEA like ours, we'll just go, we don't.
Oh, yeah,
we'll
you have your
But y'all,
internal staff
these other
who can
folks,
do that. But
yeah.
yes, I can see with charter schools where it would be a burdensome.
Yeah,
And
that's
even if that were thrown into, the charter board,
Right.
administrative piece.
Yes.
That's exactly what I was
Yes.
thinking, that's something that we would go talk to Jennifer about.
Yes.
See.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So-
thank you for sharing
Thank you. Yeah,
that.
that's very helpful.
As it stands now, Grant Cutler's done first, and so we've shared it with our other partners. Here's an example. So thank you, Grant. It's very helpful.
You bet.
That would have been helpful. Ours is done, so let's be getting into it, but
Yeah.
our situation's maybe a little different anyway, it sounds like.
Yeah, but that's prohibitive. If you have to hire someone to help you
Yes.
through, that's prohibitive. Yeah, so thank
Absolutely.
you.
And it costs money that you
Right,
don't really
that
have.
you need to be putting towards
for that
improving outcomes.
purpose.
And clearly I'm not unique.
Yes.
Right,
no,
right, yeah,
Absolutely not with charters, so.
thank you.
good questions, good discussion. That's why we're here to meet together.
If we are a secondary school and we have more than the number of full-time staff, can we just assume that we are going to get the additional $30,000? Or do we need to get some sort of affirmation from y'all?
I think it's always safer to have the affirmation, because that will be stuff that's determined through data and statistics. So, they'll take a look at all of that stuff for the school. That's a really good question.
Do we apply?
No,
you
it's
don't
just it's gonna be determined. It will just show up in the grants management system.
Yeah.
So if you have that criteria, you qualify
Yeah,
for that.
because it's a
additional-
large school, it's a large faculty,
Yeah.
a lot of students, or very, very remote schools
Sure.
where a provider would
the
have
location
a
piece is
great
easy
deal of
because that
travel
is fixed.
expense involved.
But
Yes.
staff
Yes,
One of
fluctuates.
our schools qualifies, if you read the law.
yeah, because of the
Travel-wise.
travel.
However, we as providers have told them that we would prefer that money stay with them because they need to purchase curriculum. And so right now, they're in a holding pattern because they don't have enough money in their hoppers to purchase the curriculum. It came out in Paul's report, it came out in our
Yeah,
initial evaluation. And so the longer they wait for that money, the more problematic implementation is going to be, just to illustrate a challenge that charters have, because their systems don't have float. Mitch has float.
Yes.
They just don't have that.
Right.
Also a good.
Yeah, really good points.
And this year was very, very delayed for so many different reasons.
Yeah, the fact that through the just I brought this up, but you know, I kind of very passively just mentioned that our ESSA Consolidated Plan was approved for the state to the tune of $100 million plus just a couple of days ago. And it involved a lot of the alignment for state turnaround. And so just that in and of itself caused a lot of it. They're great questions, and they're things we need to continue to take back to the sections here in the agency to get things moving forward quicker. So I appreciate it.
On that note, do you have any idea when we're going to get official word on ESSA money? Title work money?
They're working on it as fast as they can.
Do you guys have it?
We don't have it. No, the money doesn't ever come to us. The
Becky's got it in the chest in the trunk of her car.
The money's at the Treasury.
I know that, but has the official word come here and then they're trying to get it done?
Yes, we have our award letters.
Okay, that's what good.
So they're trying to get everything ready so the UCA can open for people to apply, and they're working like around the clock almost. Our finance staff is to try to get everything ready in that new grants management system. Like they've opened special ed, I think.
Yep.
Career and technical education's been opened.
Students was first. We were second.
Yeah, so they've opened a few things, and just this week, we're working off of a big spreadsheet from Natalie Grange, our finance assistant superintendent, that had every single funding stream that comes into the agency, whether it's state, federal, whatever it happens to be, with timelines of, you know, when they hope to get this open, and they need to get this piece done, and as soon as that piece is done, then, and so staff is all putting together everything that they possibly need, you know, last minute documentation or PDF fillable forms or, you know, spreadsheets, whatever it takes to try to get that done as quickly as possible. So
Natalie's original timeline date that she set for the agency was next Friday.
Okay.
So, and they're working like
Yeah, they
mad,
are
but
working
next
like
Friday
crazy.
was
They
the date
really
that she
are.
really hoped she would be able to send the email saying, hey, all the amounts are loaded.
yeah, and program staff as well. Everybody's just, you know, scrambling to make sure everything's done on everybody's part, and it's a big lift, that new system. So
to keep on this vein, we're on a 1-year compromise with our ESSA plan. Does that mean that going into future discussions we're going to have a completely different plan, or?
No, because the 1-year compromise is that all that any opt-out that creates participation less than 95%,
Yeah.
right? So as soon as we have less than 95% participation, all of those opt-outs become zeros in proficiency. Will just happen next year unless the board takes some other kind of action. And if you just happened to be watching board meeting last week or in the audience, although I didn't see any of you in the audience, but if you happened to be watching board meeting last week, you know that they had a 2-hour discussion about whether or not it was worth their time and effort to try to reapply, or since they requested 2 waivers and didn't get either one of them. So if they don't request another waiver, then next year every opt-out below the 95%, every lack of participation, not all lack of participation is opt-out, but the majority is, every student who doesn't participate in the assessment below 95% will count as a 0. So what we talked to the feds about is, can we then do a secondary analysis of all of the schools who end up in the bottom 5%, but who, when we when we run an algorithm, it is likely that the reason that they're in the bottom 5% is because they had less than 95% participation. Can we choose to not support them financially, professionally?
Through CSI.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's what we have, the 1 year. Let's see how that goes. That's what we have, the 1 year try and see if you do that secondary review, if you are giving resources to the schools who really need it. So we'll do that, and we'll see how it goes, and then report back.
But state accountability wise, anybody not hitting that as a virtual school would struggle to hit that, right, for various reasons.
For state accountability, we'll run that analysis anyway.
Okay, but will it be under the new accountability system then an automatic F, or I mean,
No.
how does, okay.
No, we'll run that analysis anyway, because state law requires that if a student opts out, that you're not held accountable for that, right? That there's no consequence.
Right.
Well, there is a consequence federally,
Yes.
which we couldn't get out of. But state law doesn't
Okay.
allow there to be a consequence.
Right.
So by state law, then we are required to run that secondary analysis. It's whether or not we're going to continue. I mean, we'll continue to run it for state accountability. The 1 year is whether or not we're going to do something about it after we've run it for federal accountability.
Sure.
Did that make
It
sense?
does.
I don't know how articulate that was. Did everybody
Yeah.
get
It does, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
For CSI, wouldn't that just be for Title I schools anyway? It really is just turnaround and the marrying of the two systems?
Well, the issue we have with our 1003A school improvement funding is that, and you remember Mitch as a Title I director, that the first year that ESSA went into place as far as the fiscal rules, SEAs had to set aside 7% off the top of their Title I funding, and there was no hold harmless for LEAs. Well, now we're in the second year, hold harmless does kick in. And so the first year we were able to set aside just a little over $6 million for Title I school improvement. This year it's barely over $3 million. So our funding is very erratic in the way that the feds applied the hold harmless rule. So, you know, my friend in Kansas, last year they set aside $7 million. This year they have $1 million. And our friends from Oregon had $10 million the first year. They're down to $4 million.
Yeah.
So our capacity, so schools will be identified if they fall within those criteria, but the amount of funding we're going to have available to allocate to those schools in the future could be very, very limited.
And because of that, our big concern is that the schools who actually need it are the schools who get it.
So we're trying to,
For
you
sure.
know,
Yeah.
not
We think
provide
about that all the
funding
time.
to
Right.
a school that's
Skyline
really,
gets money when grades
yeah,
get
it's a high-performing school, but a lot of students opted out of the test, and so would we give funding to that school over a school that really, really needs the funding? That's what we're trying to balance out with the
That's the issue.
compromise.
Makes sense to me.
Max, any clarification on exit criteria?
Yeah, you mean for the cohort
For
two?
cohort
So
two.
in 2 years, well, the board rule stays the same with the same for those cohort 1 schools. It says, you know, essentially what we're trying to stick to is what gets you in is what gets you out. So
Sure.
there were weighting indicators there. In this past year, what year are we in? 2017, 2018, so the beginning of the year there. So that same weighting criteria in 2 years will be used to determine progress.
And you just had to get out of the bottom 3% 2 years in a row, right? Isn't that what the new law says? The first law was improve your grade. The new law was get out of the bottom 3% 2 years in a row.
Yes.
Is that right?
Get out of the bottom 3%,
2
2 years in a row.
So it had,
Okay. On which accountability
And I'll tell you
system?
what, let me do this too.
That's the question.
Let me go through the board rule and actually kind of pull that language out and send it to you all, okay?
Yeah, but I also agree it would be nice to know specifically the accountability that we're going to be held to, because it is changing dramatically. And the population we serve at Guadalupe School, for all of you who don't know me, we're going to be affected more than a lot of others, I think, because of the new grading system. So.
Yeah, exactly. Just for that purpose, we want to be able to strategize.
Well, we have to be able to track against that,
and
right?
track
I mean,
it. Yep. Our board wants to know too.
If I'm not monitoring the right things, or the data that I have is tainted or shifted, we're going to have a negative or hopefully positive surprise. But
it's a really good thing. I'm glad you brought it up, because I'll tell you, the conversations I've been in with data and statistics are so heavily weighted on exit criteria for Cohort 1 right now that they've kind of put on the back burner talking about exit criteria for Cohort 2. So it's something I really need to bring up and have a discussion with them. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Well, I know this is an arbitrary or a loosely aligned thing, but you said that you got to start with where we're trying to get to, and where we're trying to get to ultimately is get out. So, and if they don't know how to get out, then it's just hard.
Yeah, I'm glad you.
One comment along that as well, with the changes that are happening, it's going to be an awful lot easier for schools to be able to track against current standards, because you're going to be reporting against those. If it's possible to take and shift what gets us out, not necessarily what the criteria was that we went in, because it was so transitional last year, but rather the change that we're going to hold on to, it actually is going to, I think, improve the continuity that you're going to have going forward.
Okay.
So 11 has its own piece of the pie. So there are 3.
Yes, I'll bring those. I meet with those folks and they talk way over my head all the time.
The only other that you kind of think about these things, but you don't want to ask them because they sound really icky, is what if we have a school in Cohort 1 that doesn't get out and doesn't qualify for an extension?
Yeah, there are some continuing accountability measures that are kind of loosely defined.
And nobody wants to do that.
There's 3 parts of it.
It's a good question. I mean,
keep it on people's burners.
Yeah, because the board rule requires some committee to be put together and make some determinations. There's some continuing like instructional audit that occurs there, and then beyond that, it does put in some kind of final sort of things. But they're pretty vague. They're pretty kind of loosely organized in there. So you're right. It's one of the things that's on the agenda that's got to be really figured out and all the steps involved.
Well,
the right questions though.
And as a part of an LEA that has lots of participants super excited and willing to be part of developing the solutions. So.
Duly noted. Yeah. That's why that's why we have those stakeholder meetings. You're sitting around the table. So thank you. Okay, really good conversation, comments. I don't know if our folks that are online, Jennifer, Becky, and Julie are still there, but I want to thank for your participation. If you have additional questions, please contact me. You now know who I am, so give me a call. Usually I don't know, but I work really hard to get the people who do, so I will get an answer for you, even if the answer is, I don't know yet. This is what's happening, so I can do that. Anything further? What do you guys think about our new gates out there to get into the parking lot?
Yeah.
That's goofy.
Huh?
That's goofy. Is it dangerous here? Is it
Please, Becky, please.
No, we have a bunch of people a bunch on certain days when the building is full, a bunch, is relative. But there are enough people that come and park here that then jump on tracks to go to the U, or that go to the restaurants, or that it's easier to get in here than it is the library. So when you are coming for an official meeting, you can't find parking.
No parking.
Right.
That makes sense.
They
Yeah.
have the sand.
I just wanted to say
Yeah.
one thing about
We,
the,
as employees, cannot find parking because the students are parking here to go to the U.
I just go home.
one thing about this handbook, we view this as a living document. We're always going to be revising and updating, so as we get into the implementation of these things and you find things that just are not working, we want to know that feedback. If you look in here and you see errors, I mean, we did have it edited, but there's always, yeah, we sent it out to someone who's a really, fabulous editor, and she went through and edited the whole thing. Becky and Max, I think, said they noticed some page numbering maybe that's off a little bit, but if you notice things that are errors, or things that just aren't working, that we need to tweak, please let us know, because we're very open to that. We don't view this as a rigid.
It's great. It's good. It's really good. I will say on the implementation thing, full implementation is supposed to start year 2 and we're done by then. And then later on in the document it says that you better be in full implementation by the end. Those seem to be at odds with each other, but.
That's a good point, yeah.
But I mean, the science behind implementation and the law are
Yeah,
at
the
odds
law,
with each other.
yeah, the
so-
law don't, and the science don't.
So listen, I can certainly write a note if anybody wants to say this meeting until 5 o'clock. I'm more than happy to do that. And, be safe going where your travels go. I know some of you are going clear across country or flying out of Salt Lake. I hope you get a chance to take a look around at our city and our state. We love having you here. Please feel free to get a free drink of water from the fountain on your way out the door. And thank you. We'll be in touch. So,
Title I funds did
thank
not
you.
purchase that water.
Title I funds did not purchase that water.
That's how Lauren and Athena felt about it too, so I'm glad.
And just as a reminder, because it's under construction there, you have to go out this door, through the double doors, turn left.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Good to see you guys.
So we need. I think we just need to.
She's doing well. Well, actually, one of the challenges that this things that we noticed in our organization
So you come across Melissa Ramsey in Florida. Is she on your
our children.
Yeah, so
team?
what
Just like a really state people.
I don't.
So one of the things that
The meeting that I was at,
She's probably, she shouldn't be there now.
So let's jump in.
She's probably there. So I've never taken it to the
so one of the things that we so that our previous started probably an interactive.
Yeah, we've been working closely with Florida on
from that to a laptop system so that they're ready for testing.
simplifying a lot of this.
So that's one of the needs that
Very quick communication.
we're saying that we'd like to.
It's having come from I was in schools and then I went to the state level for several years and
Together, we,
she just saw John.
Like I want to put
So
and if I don't
stay in touch.
any support schedule.
Yeah, it's complex system. New York's not got it right. I mean, even when I was there.
yes.
You have the city and everyone
Yeah, that would be a real.
it required a shift in personality depending on where you are, right? But if we can, yeah, that was developed by our Regents Fellows during the time I was there. It is good, yeah. A lot of people are using it for curricular values.
have to
Yeah.
So
bring
that
that
our
back
thinking
to
is
have
okay, we're